You're listening to XVGM Radio. Welcome to XVGM Radio, where the bits keep coming. I'm Justin.
And I'm Mike.
And this is episode 87, Super Nintendo Orchestrated with Orchestral Fantasy.
Oh man, we have a very special guest that has been in the works, at least between Justin and I, for quite some time. We got clued into our guest today, whose name is Andrew Thompson. It must have been about a year ago that somebody posted on my YouTube, which is where we post all the alternative versions of episodes. So it's like if you wanted to listen on YouTube, you could. I just basically, I give you an option to do it. Mm-hmm. And somebody reached out and was like, hey, have you guys ever considered Orchestral Fantasy? And we were like, who? And they were like, you should go find that out. So I did. I looked into it and I was like, wow, these are really cool orchestrated versions of classic songs. So I put it on the back burner. I was like, all right, Justin, we got to get this person on the show. Then we forgot about it. Or then we got busy or something came up and I never reached out. Well, all that changes right now because we've got Andrew on the show. Thanks for joining us on this very special episode dedicated to your music.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
So tell everybody a little bit about what you do with your music.
Well, I'm a classical musician, and I've always been in love with video game music. Some of the first music that I really found myself falling in love with. I decided that I should, put some of my musical training to recreating some of my favorites, mostly from the Super Nintendo, but a couple other systems as well, and doing new versions with real instruments. But for the most part, I try to keep the same arrangement that was on the original games, but I just kind of spruce it up with real instruments so that there's not quite so much MIDI sounds in it, things like that, just to give it a little bit of a more realistic kind of feel to it.
Yeah, nice. It's definitely shown in this first track that we played, which was from Final Fantasy VI, also known as Final Fantasy III in the United States. So this came out on the Super NES in 1994, and the track that we played was merely a snippet of the full entire piece, which is Dancing Mad Part 1. That was originally composed by Nobuo Uematsu. The first version that you heard was Andrew Thompson's version through Orchestral Fantasy, and the second version was the original Super Nintendo version. Now you're probably saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, whoa, that's not the full song. Yeah, no. Because if you go to his YouTube and you listen to it, it's like a 12-minute song. So because we didn't want to start off the show with a 24-minute comparison with no explanation, we figured, you know what, let's play the first 3 minutes parts or 3.5 minutes or whatever of just the first part of Dancing Mad. And then you can go yourself and go listen to the full version, which is definitely worth it. Please go check it out.
Yeah, that was a really tough decision to make too, because Dancing Mad is one of my favorite Final Fantasy songs. So when you were like, oh, we don't want to do a 24-minute intro, I was like, why not? Like, absolutely. This song rocks.
Yeah.
Even with the snippet that we played here, I obviously it still rocks. It's not any less great just because we played a smaller version, but
oh, for sure.
Man, I love the way that this was punched up. Full disclosure, I love Final Fantasy VI. It's not like top of my list, as most people know. Final Fantasy IX is top of my list. Final Fantasy VI is pretty close. It's in my top 5, and Dancing Mad is also in my top 5 songs. And one of the reasons that it is so high up there, it's a great song, but the Black Mages version is what really pushed it over the edge for me years and years ago. I love what they did with it, but I have to say, the stuff that you've done here, Andrew, is just above and beyond. I think most people that are into Final Fantasy music really, really love One Winged Angel. I don't think One Winged Angel is garbage, but compared to this, One Winged Angel can go take a hike. I love the vocals. I love everything about it, and I'm gonna add the full version to my normal Final Fantasy playlist. But something that I noticed, and I don't know if it was intentional or if it was something weird happening on my end, but I have to ask, is there echo on the vocals that we were listening to?
Just a little bit. I did record an actual real pipe organ, so I added some reverb to the vocalists to kind of try to mimic that same kind of room feel that of being, you know, in a real church would be. You know, obviously during the pandemic, even if we weren't in the pandemic, it would be really hard to get enough singers together in my, you know, home studio to record. So everybody recorded remotely. So everybody had, you know, varying mic qualities and varying, you know, room noises and all that kind of stuff. So it was a bit of a challenge. One of my friends in the video game music community, he's Scandinavian. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but Frederick Hatton, something like that. But he did the mixing for me for the choirs because he's got a lot more experience than I do in that respect.
Yeah, I heard the echo on the vocal portion, and I thought I thought it added so much like richness to the overall piece. I didn't hear it at first, like maybe about a minute or so in, and I was just like, oh, I hear like a little bit of echo, and it's funny, like I didn't really put it together like the whole like the reverb that you would get in like a church setting, but it makes perfect sense, and that's just, it's one of the things that I really liked about it because it gave me that feeling. And I mean, I'm usually pretty good at like visualizing things in my head when I'm listening to music, and while I didn't get like necessarily a church, I definitely got like this big open space with like not a whole lot of reverb, but just enough that it has this warmth. So I really liked that about it.
It's funny because before we started the show, we were going to listen to the track as we usually do, and Justin was kind of like, "Oh well, you know, we don't need to hear the original or whatever because you know we're all familiar with it." And I was like, I'm not familiar with it because I haven't gotten to this part in the game yet. My experience with Final Fantasy VI goes back to playing the game on emulator back in, I'd say, like early college. So, you know, maybe around like 2001, 2002. I didn't own it when it came out. I was a Chrono Trigger guy, like all the way. And so I didn't really get into Final Fantasy until 7. So this was one of those songs that I had heard so much about, like this and, you know, all the other like late in the game moments, but I've only gotten to the Ghost Train in this game. So, you know, I'm familiar with a lot of the music in the game. You know, I just don't have any concept of what happens. Is this the opera scene, the famed opera scene?
No, this is basically, I compared it to One Winged Angel because it's basically the One Winged Angel songs, like final battle.
Right. Also, your little dig on Final Fantasy VII and One Winged Angel. I mean, listen, Justin, you're a big fan of Final Fantasy VIII, so you could suck an egg for all I care. Thank you very much.
I didn't say it was terrible. I'm just saying, like, comparatively, One Winged Angel can take a hike. Like, I like the song, and I really liked the orchestral fantasy version.
I really dug this version of the track. I mean, the original sounds good, but you know, you really notice the fact that it's on the Super Nintendo when you compare the two versions, especially those vocals in the beginning. That really stood out to me, and just like the overall orchestral vibe of the entire thing. I mean, you could tell when something's recorded with real instruments versus using the Super Nintendo sound chip. So this is not necessarily going to be like a, you know, deep dive into the Super Nintendo library, because we've done those sort of things before where we compare and contrast like Super Nintendo with Genesis or Super Nintendo with, you know, other stuff, you know, other versions of certain songs. But more specifically, we wanted to highlight Andrew's work and how much like more impressive these songs, these compositions sound with a real orchestral arrangement. You know, we'll talk about Nobuo Uematsu later, but really he needs no introduction because we've talked about him to death on this show. He's one of our favorite composers.
Yeah. I think actually most of the compositions that we're going to be talking about, the originals, the original composers are folks that we've talked about a lot on this show. So I feel like we're going to spend a little less time talking about the original composition composers and just a lot more time talking about Andrew and Orchestral Fantasy.
Those Latin lyrics were written by Stefano Vittori, who is a poet living in Italy, who's also an academic. I think he's a language teacher at a university there, but he's fluent in Latin and wrote all the Latin poetry and actual classical Latin with the the poetic meter and all that kind of stuff. And we worked closely together to make sure that the lyrics were relevant to the story of the piece and fit the metric structure of Latin.
That's really cool.
That's awesome. As Mike would say, get out of my head, Charles. I was literally about to ask you about those lyrics. You are spot on here because I could not remember if the Black Mage's version of this song had lyrics or not. It's been a while since I've gone and listened to it, and I was reading along because you provided us a number of complimentary things, and I saw the lyrics were in a spreadsheet, and I was like, that's weird. And then I saw, because there was all the different translations, and I was like, this is awesome. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Now,
For anybody who's watching on YouTube, I do have those available as subtitles as well.
Nice.
Oh,
nice.
cool. Now, Beyond Fantasy is the name of the album that you've recently put out. It was like late December that it was released. Tell me, is this available on like Bandcamp? Can people like go and buy this CD if they wanted like a physical release of it?
Unfortunately, it's not on Bandcamp due to licensing reasons.
Right.
But it is available on Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon, any other digital distribution.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, just for whatever legal reasons, the streaming is considered a different license than printing physical copies.
Okay. Now,
So
did you get this
just
license?
because half of them are covers,
Right.
Right. Did you get this license with Square or Square Enix?
There's a company called the Harry Fox Agency, which is kind of responsible for finding the rights holders and organizing the licenses and stuff like that. So I didn't work with them directly, but I worked through services that kind of work as a middleman to make it easier for people who don't have lawyers on their side.
Gotcha.
Yep,
That's
yep.
really cool. So, in doing this, you're not only respecting the original artists and everything, but you're also, by supporting the album, picking up the album, you're, supporting the fans and the fan base too. So everybody go check out Beyond Fantasy if you like what you heard.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are not a Super Nintendo fan, get out. But if you're not a Super Nintendo fan, you may want to change the dial or go check out something else. But if you're open-minded and you're into Super Nintendo, we should probably get started and kick off our first track, which is Justin's pick, right?
Yeah, so we will jump right into it. The track that I'm going to play for y'all is first, obviously, the Orchestral Fantasy track. This is from ActRaiser, the SNES game that came out in 1990. The track is known as The World Tree. It's also on some soundtracks known as All Over the World. Original composition you'll hear second is Yuzo Koshiro, and right now we are going to hear the Orchestral Fantasy version. Okay, that was Orchestral Fantasy's version of The World Tree from ActRaiser, and now we're going to hear the original Yuzo Koshiro composition, also known as The World Tree or All Over the World, from the SNES in 1990. All right, you're back. That was Yuzo Koshiro's version of All Over the World or The World Tree. Man, I love ActRaiser. It's such a great game. I got it the Renaissance on the Switch, which has the new like fully orchestrated score as well as a few extra tracks. Man, going back to the Orchestral Fantasy version. What a difference. Like I like a lot of the music on the SNES. I've always been an SNES music fan, but hearing them back to back like that, like very, very clearly, like you hear a lot of the limitations of the SNES. I mean, both versions were very high energy, but the Orchestral Fantasy version felt way, way more full. I would say probably because there's a lot more instrumentation going on there. But one of the things that I noted, and I just like kind of compared as we listened between them, in sort of like the middle of the section, there's the part where it slows down, and then in the Orchestral Fantasy version, it sounds to me, and I could be wrong, but it sounds to me like a guitar doing a do 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 do, and when it happens in the SNES version, it sounds more like a harp. And I was like, oh, I didn't really know what to expect. Because I didn't remember that little bit, but it stood out to me, just like how cool it sounded. Like it sounded kind of like a guitar with nylon strings, almost like a Spanish guitar. And I'm kind of curious about that bit. Like, was that originally intended to be a harp in the SNES version, and were you trying to imitate that here, or like how did you approach that? Because I like the way it sounded.
So yeah, that actually is a harp. It's that's a lever harp, which is a little bit smaller body, kind of about the same size as an acoustic guitar would be. and it's also got nylon strings, kind of the same as a classical or Spanish guitar. So that's kind of why it sounds like that. It's kind of, you might say, a little brother of the full orchestral harp. So probably what Yuzo Koshiro would have intended would be an orchestral harp in that section, but I didn't really have access to that, so I kind of had to make do with what I had. But I agree that I do kind of like that more intimate sound to it, rather than something grand that you might get with a full orchestral harp.
Yeah, no, really, because like I said, when it happened in the SNES version, I was like, okay, like that sounds like it's intended to be a harp, but like honestly, I prefer the sound that you guys had. I couldn't think of the word, but like you said, it sounded felt a little bit more intimate, and that's I think that's the perfect way to describe it. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I of course really love this orchestral fantasy version of this track. I love, as Justin said, I feel the same way about ActRaiser. I love ActRaiser. It's one of my favorite games on the Super NES. I gotta ask though, Justin, because you mentioned the Renaissance version that just came out on the Switch fairly recently. Mm-hmm. Have you heard this version of the song like redone through Yuzo Koshiro's new music, and how does it compare, if you have, with the Andrew's version?
I don't think I have, actually. This is the song. I think this is like one of the end game songs, if I remember. It's the
last action stage before you do the last boss rush.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought. So that's actually where I am in the game. I have not done, like, I need to do that. So I stopped right before I would have actually heard this song.
Okay.
Comparing the other tracks though in the Renaissance version to their originals, like it really, like, They really did just take the originals and then literally orchestrate what was originally done. So not that it doesn't sound better or anything, but it sounds exactly like the SNES version if the SNES were live instruments instead of sound samples.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is that we're going to be repeating ourselves a lot in this episode, in the sense that we're obviously going to be, for the most part, saying that we prefer Andrew's versions of these songs to the original. And that's just mostly because I think Justin can agree that we're both really big fans of actual instrumentation, and that chiptunes, we don't have a problem with them. We love them. But at the same time, when you put something through that orchestral filter in that sense, it's going to blow it away, because, you know, you're working with such interesting limitations on the Super Nintendo. But what's interesting about this track, and just Yuzo Koshiro on the Super Nintendo in general, is his way of instrumentizing like music on the console is simply incredible. Very similar to like the Super Castlevania 4 soundtrack. If you listen to, for example, Super Adventure Island or even ActRaiser, the instrumentations that he's working with sounds exactly or very similar to actual instruments. So that's one of the benefits that you get with dealing with, somebody as great as Yuzo. So to hear these versions kind of, bring the song to life, I think with a track like this, you're going to notice the things to really pick apart on the Super Nintendo version as compared with this more orchestral version is, of course, the drums, in particular, like the cymbals, the snares. They all definitely stand out as being not real instrumentation. But the horn section sounds like a horn section. It's obviously not as pronounced as in the orchestral fantasy version, but it's very clear that Yuzo did his absolute best that he could. And he's even commented in interviews too, saying that like he felt that his instrumentizing of music was some of the best on the Super NES. So, not to tune his own horn, but
Da-da-da.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I must say that I was really impressed with the way that he made use of the samples that he had in order to fit. The Super Nintendo can only play 8 sounds at the same time, which means 8 notes at the same time for the most part. But for example, he had string samples that were in multiple octaves, so that he could write these fast lines and only use one channel instead of 3. But of course, I had to record all the different violins and violas to get that. But it was a lot of fun, so I didn't complain.
Yeah,
I agree. And in the instrumentation on the SNES, like it does sound great, but what it always kind of comes down to for me is it always sounds like MIDI. And again, like Mike was saying, chiptune stuff like that, it's not a problem. Like, oh, it's not like, oh, MIDI, how terrible. But again, like that's how plebeian.
Yeah.
But you compare it to like true instrumentation, and there just really isn't a comparison. Like, nothing against Yuzo Koshiro, nothing against any of these composers. They worked with the equipment they had on the SNES, and it was fantastic. But you can't hold a candle to the real thing. So
True.
One of the other things I wanted to ask Andrew, was there any artistic license taken with any of the arrangements?
Yeah, a little bit. There was a lot more on, for example, on Dancing Mad. I added choir in parts where there wasn't choir, and I added some strings and brass which weren't in the original. With this one, I kept it pretty close. I did add some more woodwinds. The original track basically only had flute, was the only woodwind, but I added some clarinets and bassoon and contrabassoon. I also just kind of filled things out just a little bit. Like I said, with the only eight channels available to them, there's sometimes where I could feel like he wanted to have a little bit bigger sound than what he was capable of doing. So I kind of filled in some of that. And for example, like sometimes, you have, like on the timpani, would go like, but whereas on the original, in order to save tracks, like they would cut off that last note and replace it with a cymbal. And just have, a low note in the bass kind of fill it in. But since I don't have those channel limitations, I kind of, just would stack the percussion, on a downbeat to make it a little bit bigger and feel a little bit stronger. Which, I think that's what he would have done if he had more channels available to him.
I agree. It sounds like the arrangement that you did really took into account like Yuzo's composition style and kind of what he was going for in the original, which really is one of the many reasons that this blows the SNES stuff out of the water. Very nice.
All right, Yuzo's discography or gameography. We'll just mention a few games because we've talked him up to death.
Oh, yes.
Justin, toss us, 3 games.
In 2004, he did Wangan Midnight Maximum Tune. In 2013, it did Etrian Odyssey Untold, The Millennium Girl, and closer to today, they did the music composition for Secret of Mana in 2018. That's the remake for the Switch, I believe.
Oh, I didn't know that Yuzo did the arrangement for Secret of Mana.
Neither did I, but now we know.
All right. The more you know.
One of the things that kind of blew my mind, something that I found out, relatively recently, is that, he also did, the soundtrack to the East games. And I remember thinking, wait, that was done by the same guy who did Actraiser?
Yep. Yeah, the first 2 games were done by Yuzo. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
No, I think Yuzo had a hand in the second one, but I think he did the first one all by himself, if I recall. But
yeah, the second and the second one he did. I'm pretty sure he did the opening theme, which is kind of like the most famous thing from that entire soundtrack.
Yep. All right, let's move on to Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, one of my favorite games of all time. Again, came out in the Super NES in 1992. This is the ending credits theme, and this is by Koji Kondo. We're going to play the Orchestral Fantasy version first. All right, so that was the orchestral fantasy version of the song Ending Credits from Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. We're going to go ahead and listen to the original Super Nintendo version by Koji Kondo. All right, welcome back. That was the Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, the Super Nintendo masterpiece that came out in 1992 in the US, 91 in Japan. That track was Ending Credits, and it was by Koji Kondo. Man, I have a lot to say about this one, but I gotta say, like, listening to both versions back to back, it was so hard to choose which one I liked better, and it was to the point where I was like, you know what, let me go back and listen to the Orchestral Fantasy version again, because initially, like, listening to it, it was tough because I almost let nostalgia get the best of me in a lot of ways. But I think what it boils down to is the note bends, or not really the note bends, but the sustain on the Super NES melodies especially in the beginning, the da-na-na, da-na-na. When the notes hang, they have an almost like almost like a bend or a sustain to them that I don't know what it is, but like I prefer it to real instruments, which is so crazy to think about. But for me, that bend and that whatever that is very haunting. It's hard to replicate something like that with real instrumentation, or at least I would assume so. But in listening to Andrew's version, it definitely captures all the spirit and the moments of each track, but for whatever reason, that specific little tidbit from the original just really stands out to me and makes the track that much more haunting than Andrew's version, which sounds a lot more, especially with the trumpets more towards the end when the Zelda fanfare comes back in, the overworld fanfare. It sounds so much more vibrant and happy sounding almost, whereas the Super Nintendo version sounds still a little bit, somber. Yeah, more towards the end.
I would agree on most of that. One of the things that I ended up doing was kind of bouncing between the two versions a bunch in a comparison, because like I listened to the Orchestral Fantasy version first, and I really enjoyed it, and then the SNES version started playing, and I was like, this feels a lot closer than I expected, and in more ways than just like the music matches, but like the instrumentation. I feel, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you stuck very faithful to the original on your arrangement here, because like we start out with strings on both versions, and then there's that little like flute solo that comes in, and we stay predominantly strings until about 2:15, where you get like the brass just starting to come in, and then like somewhere or just before the 3-minute mark, like you get the rest of the orchestration. And I don't know why I wasn't expecting it to be so similar, but like going back and forth and bouncing to like find the moments, and I was just like, wow, like this is a faithful recreation of the original. And I didn't see a lot of like artistic license or interpretation, which is fine, but like I like that it, because of how famous and how popular the song is, like how close you kept to the original.
Yeah, I did take a little bit of liberties. It's mostly in the second half of it when the Zelda theme comes back in. In the original, there's kind of a counter melody that's just the flute. When I tried to do this before, I did there's a previous version of this on my YouTube channel that I had done early in my channel, probably like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even more. But I did the flute parts on a variety of recorders, and it was just so hard to get that flute sound to really pop, once the brass were in. So what I did this time was actually took some of those flute parts and I rearranged them and put them in solo brass instruments. Like there's a part that's in the flugelhorn, part that's in euphonium. So I kind of gave it a little bit more power to that counter melody in the second half. There's also a couple places as I was going through that, I could tell that Koji Kondo was doing had to do some struggles to keep up with the 8-channel limitation. So the original version that I have on my YouTube channel, I kept it pretty much exactly the way it was. But in this version, I kind of took a little bit of creative liberty, not necessarily to change it, but kind of to do what I think he would have done if he had more than 8 channels to work with.
Yeah.
Like, for example, where the strings, there's a part where the bum, 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 and the strings cuts off just kind of abruptly as more brass instruments come in. So I kind of continued that into a more logical place for that to kind of, subside into the background. And he also used kind of the same trick that Yuzo Koshiro did with ActRaiser, where he has samples and octaves, and he used that with the horns at the end there. So rather than keeping everything in octaves there, I just kind of rewrote it the way I would write, like a 4-horn part rather than a 2-horn part doubled in octaves. So there's just really subtle things that I changed. Probably the least subtle would just be, changing the flute for some brass instruments in the second half there, but I really tried to keep it the feeling of the original because, it's something that is really nostalgic for me as well.
So one of the things I really love about Orchestral Fantasies versions of these classic songs is specifically the instrumentation when it comes to like flute style arrangements or woodwinds. Particularly, I've seen a number of your videos on YouTube where you do like a recorder, where you use a recorder. I think I've seen a piccolo flute used a few times. I gotta say, that really makes a significant difference. And in this track, too, the instrument there, and more towards the beginning, when that comes in, that what is that? That's a recorder, right?
Actually, in this version, it's an ocarina.
Oh,
Jordan Moore is the low brass guy that I worked with on this. He did the low brass on the second half. He's also got a YouTube channel where he does a lot of video game covers, and it's excellent. I would definitely recommend Jordan Moore's channel. But he also has many different sizes of ocarina, and he does some arrangements for like ocarina ensembles where it's just like ocarina choirs. And I figured because ocarina is such an important part of Link to the Past that it's only fitting that I get him to record the ocarina for that part too, and I think he did an amazing job.
yeah, that really makes a significant difference in the tracks and the vibe that the songs are putting out. I mean, it sounds so much more rich and fulfilling in the track than what you would hear normally in like chiptune, so to speak.
Yeah.
Really cool. I got to ask, what's your music background in terms of instruments? Because you're obviously playing a lot of different stuff. I've even seen you play like bass guitar, things like that. What's your musical background?
I started studying music when I was 10. I was just kind of being, a lazy kid during the summer vacation. And my dad said, why don't you do something productive this summer, like, learn to play the violin or something like that. So I just kind of took him at face value and, we started doing violin lessons and ended up liking it. So I stuck with that pretty much all through my high school career. And then I got a scholarship to study music in college and that, and I didn't have any better majors to think of. So I just said, sure. And then
Nice.
I ended up going to a pretty small college, and for people who maybe aren't quite so familiar with the violin family, there's the violin everybody knows, the cello everybody knows, and a lot of people know the bass because it's used outside of orchestral music too, the upright bass. But then there's also the viola, which is kind of the bigger version of the violin, which is an octave higher than the cello, and I think it was my first or second year there. Our only violist in the entire school graduated. So they were like, well, if we're going to have, full orchestra parts, we're going to need somebody to learn the viola. So I just, volunteered for that and ended up liking that better than violin. So I changed my major to viola and, been having a lot of fun with that. I've picked up a lot of other instruments too. Bass guitar is, I think, my favorite outside of the violin family. Just something so satisfying about playing the bass guitar. But yeah, I've picked up a lot of other things. The recorders I use pretty heavily just because they're really easy to play and you don't have to spend decades studying embouchure and stuff like that like you do for the quote unquote real woodwind instruments. So for that, it's something I can just practice the fingerings, and if you know how to blow, then you can make a tone on the recorder. And
right, yeah.
Yeah, no, I haven't touched some of the instruments I learned a long time ago in a long time, and like amateur is the one thing that's always like I play clarinet, or I played clarinet in like high school and a little bit in college, and I think I stopped playing it for a good like 5 or 10 years, and I picked it back up and was just like, oh hey, I remember this, and my mouth hurt like after 5 minutes of playing just because like you don't have the muscle memory anymore.
Yeah, recorder, you can actually make a sound on it without actually putting it up to your lips. You can just, if you blow hard enough and enough air gets into the end of it, it makes a tone.
Yeah.
The soundtrack's by Koji Kondo. I don't really think we need to dive too deeply into Koji Kondo. We talk about him quite often on this show. I will pick one random game that he is listed on as composer. Let's go with Pilot Wings.
Nice.
1990.
Good choice.
All right, let's get into your next pick.
Yes. Due to the length of the tracks and how many things we're playing, Mike and I are only picking 2 tracks each. So this is my second and last pick of the episode. We're going to listen to Secret of Mana, the 1993 SNES game. We're going to hear the track Second Truth from the Left, originally composed by Hiroki Kikuta. And obviously, starting now, we're going to hear the orchestral fantasy version first. All right, that was the orchestral fantasy version of Second Truth from the Left from Secret of Mana. Now we are going to hear Hiroki Kikuta's original composition from the SNES, Second Truth from the Left. Here we go. right, welcome back. That was Hiroki Kikuda's Second Truth from the Left from SNES 1993 game Secret of Mana. And once again, we have some really good renditions, and I have to say, I feel like I got a lot more out of the Orchestral Fantasy version, mostly because it feels like there was just more going on. To me, this feels like what I want to hear in something that's brought from the SNES or any console into a live version, because it really feels like there's just a lot more added around instrumentation and just maybe even a little bit of the improvisation. A couple of points of things that were just happening in my head as I was listening. The opening, very similar, I mean, pretty much the same thing on both, but the Orchestral Fantasy version, something about it reminds me of like something from like the 70s, or like the opening, like a Toei opening to like an early 80s anime or something. There's just this quality to it that's very like upbeat and kind of like in your face, and like all this stuff going on, which I thought was really cool. And then like right after that, it almost like pivots on its heel and gets very playful with a lot of those pit instruments. I can never tell the difference between like xylophones, marimbas, and anything else, but like the mallet instruments really bring a lot of brightness to it. And then, like, as you get in there, like, you get to the funky section, and man, that bass slaps so hard. And I didn't feel like it did as much on the SNES. Like, the bass was good. I love me some good bass, but like, the stuff that you guys added was just, like, off the chain. And Mike, I have to ask if you had kind of a same flash as I had. Towards the middle there with all, like, the bass and the keys and everything, did you get, like, a Daddy Milk feeling? I got some Zintata. It like I had to pause the track and go look up Daddy Milk because I was like, it's just like my brain is just doing weird things, and I listened to like the middle of the song and I was like, this, not that it sounds the same, but I was like, this kind of sounds like you added some Zintata flair to this to the Secret of Mana track.
There was no shamisen. So no
shamisen solo. No.
Right. No, I was going to say that the Orchestral Fantasy version, to me, at points, sounded like a Jethro Tull song. You know, I was getting some very, like, progressive rock, folk rock kind of vibes in there, right around the part with the funky bass line, but shortly before that. So that really stood out to me. These two songs, comparatively, I mean, for one, the Orchestral Fantasy version is by far my favorite version of this song. And mostly, I think, because this is one of those tracks where the Super Nintendo instrumentation doesn't sound as, you know, in comparison with some of the other stuff that we were listening to throughout this episode, where it was really hard to tell the difference. I mean, you could listen and you could tell, but you really had to like second guess, like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, what's different here? These two sounded very different in my eyes in terms of both the instrumentation and the arrangement. I recognize the composition is the same, but I think the choices that Andrew made here really stand out as not only being the superior version of the track, but also just kind of give me a totally different vibe for this song, and one that I greatly prefer, in my opinion.
Yeah, one other thing that I would say, and something that really kind of knocks the SNES one down a couple pegs to me, and I've never noticed this on other tracks, but the SNES feels like it has trouble playing fast note runs, and I've never noticed that. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I never noticed that until I was listening to this, and I was like, oh, like those note runs, like they're not bad, but you can tell like they feel cut. I don't know. It just doesn't feel good, especially when you put it up against like actual instrumentation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're talking about the part where it's like like that.
Yeah, and literally any part where it's just a run of notes. Like the notes are played very, very fast, and it just I probably never noticed it on the SNES, but like actually hearing these back to back like this, it doesn't sound good to me.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on this, and unfortunately, I don't have any real comparison as far as the Secret of Mana game, because I unfortunately have never played it. It's sitting on my shelf complete in box, and I still have not played it. But one of these days I will. I swear, one of these days I'll play Secret of Mana. Andrew, what do you think about that? And were the changes that I'm talking about here in terms of the arrangement, was that all intentional in terms of making it sound like a Tull song, or were you actually going for a more Zuntata sound like Justin?
I wasn't really going for either of those. I was just kind of taking the original arrangement and seeing kind of what I could do with it. The original arrangement has this very kind of just basic synth brass sound. Some people might just be happy to just, dial in a synth brass on their keyboard and play it along like that. But, I actually wanted to put in some real brass instruments there. So, it's not like you're trying to mimic exactly what kind of horns, they're using in that brass section like you would with like the Yuzo Koshiro bass from Actraiser, where each brass instrument has its own particular timbre and it's made to sound like real, instruments from the orchestra. With this one, it's just, generic brass sound. So I got to go in there, and the high brass player I was working with, David Cook, who also has a YouTube channel, which I would definitely recommend. He's got a wide variety of instruments there. So I think in this, I ended up using a piccolo trumpet, standard trumpet, flugelhorn, and a tenor horn. So I kind of had a lot of different specific types of high brass sounds that I could kind of mix in. And, in some places where they had kind of repeated lines in the original, I would alternate between different horns rather than just, repeating the line over and over again like in the Super Nintendo version.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did go on my way to make sure that the drums were as close as I could be. And the drummer that I got for that, his name's Daniel Ponce. He's a really remarkable drummer from Mexico City. He actually had to record it in 2 different tracks because some of the drum parts that Kikuta had written were not exactly playable by one person on one drum set. So so he layered them in to make sure that it could be done. And to be honest, I had to do that a couple parts with the bass as well. That the bass is all very, fast and relentless. So and some of the parts I'd have to, I would play most of it the way it was, but I'd leave out a couple notes that were kind of hard, and then I would go and do another take and fill in the notes that I had to leave out.
That's a really good point now that you bring that up. This song probably has the most obvious difference between real instrumentation and what real instruments can play, like technically, in comparison with what a machine can do. That's, I think, one of the things about this track that Justin commented on earlier, where you're hearing those notes played really fast and that the Super Nintendo can't keep up with it. Part of that, I think, is the machination of the digital aspect of video game music. You'll hear something from a video game soundtrack that is just simply not playable with the appropriate tempo and instruments that you may be using either in an orchestra or anything like that.
Yeah, there were definitely some composers that tried to keep it realistic. One of the things that stands out to me a lot is Final Fantasy IV. For people who aren't too familiar with some of the orchestral percussion, there's the really big drums with a deep sound called timpani, or sometimes called kettle drums.
Yeah.
Have evolved a lot over the years, and nowadays they have foot pedals where you can change the pitch while you're playing and all that stuff. But when they first were kind of introduced, generally you'd only have 2 or 3, and you couldn't change the pitch after you tuned at the beginning of the concert. So early timpani parts would be written with just 2 or 3 notes that you just have to play regardless of whether the orchestra is modulated to a different key. And in Final Fantasy IV, he does that. For each song, there's only 2 notes that the timpani has. And even if the piece changes key, then it's still got this different, the original pitches on the timpani, which due to the sample that he used, it doesn't really stand out too much. But then, by the time he gets to Final Fantasy VI, he's writing, completely chromatic things. So you would need like 10 or 12 timpani to pull it off on a real performance.
Yeah,
so there's
absolutely.
kind of a gamut to run there.
Let's get to a question from one of our patrons. We have a specific tier in our Patreon where we send out notification to them to say, hey, we're interviewing somebody, and we're picking their brain. So do you have any questions? One of them answered back. It was Ryan McPherson. First, he wanted to say, your version of Forever Rachel is dope. What do you mean that's not a question? Okay, fine. Are there pieces you wanted to cover but decided not to because they wouldn't work with your format or were too difficult to arrange?
There have been for a lot, and for a long time, Dancing Mad was one of those. But I finally decided I need to, get the choir and, get all the things that I needed and, reserve time at a church to record the organ and stuff like that. So that's always been one of them. There are some where I just don't feel like doing what I do best, which is, recreating things with real instruments would work well for, some of the tracks. You get that a lot with like the East soundtracks and some of the Mega Man games where they're kind of made to sound like they're done with synths. And I think kind of putting them on real instruments might be neat, but it wouldn't really compare to the original.
You mentioned timpani and kettle drums, and I gotta say, it really brought me back to concert band. I was in percussion and did drums for several years. So, man, it just really took me back to the fact that, just as you said, that you really can't tune a timpani in between songs.
Okay.
So it's like one of those things where, like, if I got the chance to play a timpani, I'd be like, oh man, this is great. My job's easy. I just play the notes that I need to play and I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done that. I did a little bit of timpani percussion in general with a British style brass band, which is actually where I met David Cook, who did most of my high brass stuff. For the more challenging things, they do actually expect you to retune in the middle of it, which makes it very difficult.
Wow.
Oh, wow. That's
We
crazy.
had to play once at a competition where I had practiced the timpani parts. I'd practiced all the changes, but one of the drums, the spring was broken. So as soon as you took your foot off the pedal, it would change pitch again. So I had to play with my foot constantly on one timpani.
Oh, wow.
Man,
That's crazy.
That was annoying.
That doesn't sound fun.
Well, I got to say, I would love to hear you do something from Super Castlevania 4, which I think your style would fit really well. So if you're looking for inspiration, there you go.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to do some more of that, especially now that I know that I can get in to record an organ if I need to.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Real quick, Hiroki Kikuta, you want to touch on some of his stuff?
Yeah, actually, I don't think we've talked about Hiroki Kikuta much before. I think we've played something from Secret of Mana once, but this is a name that hasn't come up a whole lot. So
On the No Nostalgia
That's
episode
right.
that we did back in, it was like episode like 20 or 21, I think.
yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yep.
So Hiroki started out doing composition on Secret of Mana in 1993. There's not a whole lot in here, so I'll keep it quick. They did the follow-up, Second Desetsu 3 in 1995, which we did not get in America. PS1 game, Koudelka in 1999, they composed for. Soul Calibur 5 they composed for, so I think we talked about them a little bit in our Soul Calibur episode too.
Yes. Yeah, that was episode, I think, 14 or 16, one of those two.
And just jumping up to the top here, they have done some things more recently. In 2018, they were one of the music composers for the newer Secret of Mana, or the remake of Secret of Mana in 2018, and their last credit is as a music composer in Indivisible in 2019.
Yeah, they do a lot of like individual guest tracks for a lot of games too, which are not listed on here. They have one coming up for Second Dimension's upcoming game that they're hoping to release as well. So if they hit a specific stretch goal in that, they will be able to hire Hiroki Kikuta to do a track for it. So pretty cool.
Very cool.
And actually, just thinking a little bit more about Kikuta's work, got that kind of an answer to the previous question too. That one thing that I don't think that I'd really be able to do justice is he uses a lot of stuff in the Secret of Mana track that uses gamelan, which is a traditional Southeast Asian percussion ensemble of like different bells and percussion instruments that just sounds amazing. Like, for example, early in the game when you go to the temple of Thanatos, the really haunting music that plays there when you're fighting like undead skeletons and stuff like that. That's gamelan. And also the second to last boss when you finally fight Thanatos before the Mana Beast. That's also a gamelan inspired track there. And I don't think I'd be able to recreate those unless I had access to a gamelan, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon.
Probably not. Oh, man. All right. Well, let's get into our final track of this episode, or rather our final comparison. We're going to be playing a song from Final Fantasy V, which is probably my favorite Super and Nintendo or Super Famicom game from the Final Fantasy series. This came out in 1992, and the track is called The Decisive Battle, and it's by Nobuo Uematsu. Here's the orchestral fantasy version first. All right, that was the orchestral fantasy version of the Decisive Battle. We're going to go ahead and listen to Nobuo Uematsu's version from Final Fantasy V. Thanks for joining us back on our Super Nintendo Orchestrated with Orchestral Fantasy episode. That was our final track, Final Fantasy V, which came out on the Super Famicom in 1992. The track is The Decisive Battle, and it's by Nobuo Uematsu. Man, I really enjoyed both of these versions, and it was pretty tough to go back and forth. Very similar to the other track that we opened up with, the Final Fantasy VI track. It's just so tough because the Orchestral Fantasy version, I think I prefer over the Nobuo version in this comparison. I really like those high tom drums that you used in the beginning of the track. That really stands out, and even like the bass and the guitar really kind of adds an additional live element to the song that none of these other tracks really had. A little bit with the Secret of Mana track just because of the bass, but it's cool to see like more modern rock style elements combined with the horn sections. And the trumpet sounded great in this as well. Really just when you think of that instrument when you're listening to the Super NES version, you could basically hear what Andrew's pulled off here with Orchestral Fantasy. So I think just really well done version of both songs. But overall, I think Orchestral Fantasy is going to be my pick on this one.
Agreed. It's funny. I mean, I'm not surprised that you pulled out the toms because you are very attuned to percussion and whatnot. But that's exactly one of the things that I was going to say is like I was also watching the video on YouTube for this.
Yeah,
and
same.
I really like the shift in focus between the different instruments, especially when it went to the recorder part. Like I was just it's fun to watch somebody play recorder because it's just not something that you see very often, or at least I don't see it very often. I mean, Mike, you have kids, so maybe your kids are going to play recorder someday and drive you nuts, but
probably.
Again, this is another one that I feel was the two versions were pretty similar, and again, I feel like this was pretty faithful to the SNES version. And for me, the main differences that I pulled out are really just like the feeling and the sound. Like again, on the SNES, like there is more of a MIDI feeling and a synth feeling, and the live instruments bring just this extra level of energy to the thing. And I mean, maybe it was also because I was watching the video and watching people play the instruments that I just was getting more engrossed in it. But I agree, like I definitely prefer the Orchestral Fantasy version because it just feels like a higher fidelity sound.
When it comes to choosing which instruments you want to use, Andrew, do you find it problematic when you're picking the instruments in the sense that you don't want to stray too far away from the sound of the original, but at the same time you want to honor it and make it as close as possible? Do you ever find yourself kind of battling that sort of feeling?
Yeah, the thing that I've been having the most trouble with is finding a good, consistent oboe player, for example. So a lot of times what I'll do is I know a couple good woodwind players who play soprano saxophone. So a lot of times I'll put the soprano saxophone in instead of the oboe, and sometimes that ends up sounding, I think, better. In this case, probably the biggest departure that I made, there's a synth bass in this originally, and I was kind of going back and forth when I was making this arrangement of whether I wanted to actually like do it on bass guitar and like put some like flangers and other kinds of effects to make it sound like a synth bass. But what I ended up doing is my friend Matthew Valente is another video game nerd who's more into the audio hardware side of it, and he made up a sound font from Chrono Trigger that has that really cool synth bass like in the Lavos battles.
Yes.
And I actually used that as the synth bass in this one instead.
I heard that, and I also read the thank yous in the YouTube video. So I got to see, like, I read it first while I was listening, and then when it popped on, I was like, oh, okay, so that was what he was talking about as far as the synth goes. I think it fits really well, and it really does pay homage to the Super NES sound style as well, in using something that came from a different game, but still fits because it's still Squaresoft. So it really made sense to use something like that there.
Yeah, that was a really nifty thing to do.
Nobuo Uematsu, we've talked about many, many times, mostly Justin's fault.
Yep, 100%.
Guilty. But I'll pick a couple random games. Terra Battle in 2014, The Last Story in 2011, and let's go Final Fantasy IV's remake in 2007. That's the one that came out on the DS.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Cool. Well, as we normally do when we end an episode, we like to pick our favorites. So we're going to try to pick the Orchestral Fantasy versions of the tracks, as well as the Super Nintendo versions, and which was our favorite for both. So we're going to let our guest go first. Andrew, what are your picks?
Well, an obvious one would probably be Dancing Mad, but I'm going to stay away from that one this time just because in the last couple months, I've been doing so much editing and mixing and all that kind of stuff that I've heard it probably 50 times every day for the last 6 months. So I'm a little bit tired of it now. So I'm going to go probably my favorite. I would go the Link to the Past credits for both versions. And then the next one would probably be the ActRaiser World Tree.
Okay.
And then I really like the Decisive Battle, but I did my version of it so long ago that I think I could probably do it better now. So I think probably I'll definitely go with that number 3 for the original. Yeah, I'll just keep it simple and not try to find a better recording for me on that one. But yeah, I'd say those are probably my 3 there.
Cool. All right, Justin?
So I have not listened to Dancing Mad 50 times a day for the last 6 months. So that really is kind of top of my list. I think as far as the Orchestral Fantasy versions, that and the Second Truth from the Left, I struggle to pick my favorite between the two of those. They're both really great, totally different tracks, so that's part of what makes it difficult for me to pick between the two of them. But as far as the Orchestral Fantasy tracks, those two are tops. As far as the SNES side of things, I think my favorite SNES track would be the ActRaiser track, the World Tree, All Over the World.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to go with the Orchestral Fantasy version of Secret of Mana for the Second Truth from the Left. No disrespect to Hiroki Kikuta, but I think Andrew's version blows that version out of the water.
Yeah.
So that's just me. But I'm going to go for the Super NES. I don't know. Man, nostalgia weighs on me pretty heavy. I think I want to say the Koji Kondo Zelda Link to the Past track for ending credits. Just something about those synths in the beginning. They really kind of like get me. This is just such an emotional track on that system. You know, it's the final track when you beat the game and, you know, you get that sunset. I just picture it. Like, I hear this track and I picture the ending in my head because I've beaten the game so many times. I just know what it sounds like. So I really find that nostalgia is kind of overpowering in that aspect of that track. So I think I'm going to go with that one. But if nostalgia was not a key in this, I would probably say the Final Fantasy V Super Famicom game version.
Okay.
Yeah. What were your favorite picks, people? Let us know in our various social media, Discord, Twitter, Instagram. You know it. You love it. Go tell us. And we want to thank Andrew Thompson for being on the show. We really appreciate you coming down. It's been a long time coming. Where can we find you on the web, and what are you working on?
So mostly I post on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/c/orchestral fantasy, or just look up Orchestral Fantasy in the search bar. So after this album that I finished, I put a lot of work into that. So right now I'm just kind of going back to doing some weekly videos. I do have one interesting thing that somebody has commissioned me to do a version of the entire Lufia 2 soundtrack. So track by track, I'll be working on that and be posting a lot more Lufia 2 as that progresses. Other than that, I'm just, keeping up to, trying to keep my weekly videos up and, finding new things to do covers of.
You did the battle theme from that on your page, and that was one of the tracks that I almost picked, but I couldn't remember if we played it on a previous episode, and I think we did, so I held off on it. But man, you guys gotta go check out that version of the song because it's really, really good. So awesome. Well, again, thanks so much for being on the show. We will have to have you back sometime so we can showcase some more epic Super Nintendo and Super Famicom orchestral music.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we need to have him back for some of the original compositions. I know we are a VGM music podcast, but the fact that your original compositions are heavily inspired by video game music and video game tracks, I think it'd be really interesting to have you back to talk about those tracks' connections to the different games and stuff. I was reading through like the liner notes that were included with the promotional pack, and like halfway through I was just like, man, I really kind of want to pick some of these because like your explanations on them are awesome and the tracks themselves are great. But like we had already decided what we were doing as far as the content here. So I agree. I think we should have Andrew back. I also think that we should just dive into some of the original compositions because they are fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Cool.
And I've also got some that my Discord server has suggested. I've got a channel there where I do composition prompts where people could just, give a scenario or a character or something like that. And then I'll go and, I'm just trying to do it more regularly, but I'll just go through and, write a quick little theme that matches that. And I have on my YouTube channel, I have some compilations of those.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Nice. So, we'd like to take a moment to thank our Patreon patrons, without whom this show's continued improvement would be impossible. They are Alex Messenger, Cam Worma, Chris Hart, Jordan and Anson Davis, Rage Cage, Kung Fu Carlito of the Heroes 3 podcast, Scott McElhone, Chris Myers, The Autistic Gamer 89, Brad Austin, Chris Murray, Llama Adam, Marcus Stewart, Nathan Cooper, Nick Davis, and Ryan McPherson.
If you would like to become a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/XVGM Radio. There you can see the different tiers as well. Just $1 gets you a thank you and access to our monthly live shows.
You can visit our website, xvgmradio.com, where you can listen to all the episodes and learn more about your hosts, as well as any of our guests or composers that we've had on the show.
If you'd like to reach out to us, you can always email us at xvgmradio@gmail.com.
If you like what you've heard, please consider giving us a review on iTunes.
You can join our Facebook group and chat with other VGM lovers at www.facebook.com/groups/XVGM Radio, where we talk about everything from current game news to sharing awesome VGM tracks or just talking about the podcast itself.
You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle on both those sites is @XVGM Radio.
If you don't have any other social media or just want to try something unique, check us out on our Discord group chat. Links in the show notes. All right, so Justin, we are coming back in a month. I almost said 2 weeks, but it is a month. We'll be back in March, and we're going to be talking about what?
We're going to be talking about my favorite thing in the world. We're going to be talking about the best and worst of GEMS, the Genesis Sound Driver.
Yes, the best and worst of the GEMS Sound Driver. We're going to pick our favorites that we found over the years and some of the worst songs. We typically try to not dwell on bad VGM, but man, we are going to dive deep into it.
Maybe this will give people an appreciation for why I avoided the Genesis so much in my early life. But yeah, it's going to be best and worst of GEMS. It will be truly, truly outrageous.
Yes. Nice reference. All right, so this is Mike
and Justin
signing off for XVGM Radio.